All right. Looks like we've got a good full house. So thank you everyone for joining once again. This hour, we're going over front-end development with Nathan Moore. Nathan, I'll let you introduce yourself and I'll just be in the background.
Yeah. So I think a number of you met me last week when doing Discovery, but my name is Nathan Moore. I've been with Broadleaf for 6.5 years now. Past several years, I've gotten to do a lot of the front-end work, but I'm full stack developer with Broadleaf. And we'll be going over just an introduction to our various front-end apps and how you can use them and develop in them with Broadleaf. All right, so just to give a quick overview of the agenda, we'll go over the Storefront Starter app, otherwise known as the Commerce Next.js Starter. We'll talk about the JavaScript SDKs. We'll have a quick QA session to go over that side of things, and then we'll switch to talking about the admin UI and talking about components, what components are, how it's structured, how to use them, how those relate to metadata, and then we'll go through and actually look at adding a new field in the admin and extending it with metadata. All right. So first, the Storefront Starter apps. So the Storefront Starter app is built with React and TypeScript and the Next.js framework. I know you guys are going to be using Angular, but just for our demos and just as a reference point, we provide this Next.js starter. So the entire source code for this front end will be provided, so you can do with it as you want, using as a reference, changing it, getting rid of things that you don't need to look at. It'll include a bunch of extra features that you may not need, like we've integrated with PayPal and Stripe, and just showing how those could look. And this is also like, we'll show tenant application resolution, catalog browse and search, cart and checkout, customer, manage content. So all these things are available through the demo or for this starter app. And so this generally going over the project structure for this follows a standard Next.js application structure. So the different views that you can see when you go to the browser, those are defined in pages directory. And so each of those defines the path. So like /checkout match things in the checkout directory. The index file would go to index.tsx. So that'd be like the home page and so on. So all of the rest of the code, the components, hooks, etc., those are found under app. And so we've grouped those by domain and then by type. So we have like cart, and then we have cart components, cart context, cart hooks. I'm not entirely sure what the Angular equivalent of these things are, but they can provide reference for you to see how you can interact with our APIs, how we manage state, and just what a component UI could look like. You'll also notice that we use a Tailwind CSS utility library. And this provides a slew of utility classes for quickly styling components and keeping styles consistent across all the different components. And I'll show you what that looks like in a second. We also have several different predefined environment variables that can help. Like if you want to point your front-end app using a remote backend, like a QA or a dev server, so you, as a front-end developer, you don't have to run the whole backend suite locally yourself. So we have ways to set that up. And we have additional documentation in the app itself because we have a docs directory and it has some guidelines, just ideas for how you can handle different things in this starter, how the code's organized. So you'll see all that code, all those docs in the app starter itself that you get. And so just looking at this Tailwind CSS, something we found to be very helpful in terms of consistency in styling and in speed of development. Because you're just writing these CSS classes that are predefined and you're not having to write a lot of custom CSS yourself. And so in this case, all of these are just the utility classes that come out of box. Like container sets a max width on the like the page itself. And then MT16, so this is margin top dash 16. So the different sizes are based on quarter rem. So 16, you just divide that by 4, and that would be 4 rem equivalent. MX, so for M left and right combined, so this is auto, margin left and margin right. Padding left and right 4, so that's 1 rem. Width full, so 100%. And then it also comes with utilities for different screen widths. So like large, so on the larger screen, so above 1024 pixels, you can say I want the margin on the top to be more or less. And on extra large, I can set a different style for the padding, left and right. So extra large would be like above 1280. And you can redefine these because there's a Tailwind config file where you can define new values and new utility classes. This is something we found to be pretty helpful, and you may want to consider adopting yourselves. So this starting up locally is pretty straightforward. You'll do your yarn install, and then if you want to point to an external server, you'll run yarn dev. And so all the default variables are set up to point to an external server. In our case, we point to our QA. And so here we're putting in the base URL, client ID. So the client ID is for the authorization client, or authorized client. And so that's configured. You can configure that in the admin. We also are setting the application token. So we're just tying this app to one of the applications rather than having it by default switch to any of the applications. And that's also configurable by property. So in this case, we're tying it to the Heat Clinic app. On the other side, at the bottom of the .env file, we do allow you to uncomment these this is on the left side of the screen. We do allow you to comment these at the bottom, and that allows you to point to a local dev server. So this is like if you're using your IDE to run the backend. So we have separate command for that for yarn local. And so I think the meat of what you'll be interested in, since you're working in Angular, will be these JavaScript SDKs that we provide. So we provide 3 groupings of them. We have the Commerce SDKs, and these are for interacting with the general commerce-facing APIs like Catalog Browse, Cart, Content, Customer Menu, Sandbox, and Tenant. And so these are all just plain JavaScript APIs or SDKs. So they're not React specific. And you can pull these in, and we'll look at an example of what it looks like to use them. But they're all set up so that there is TypeScript types that come along with it, as well as a request client that defines the out-of-box endpoints that you can hit. So just to make it simpler for someone to get started, they don't have to do this all themselves. This gets rid of a bunch of the boilerplate. And then we have the auth SDK. So this comes with a plain JS SDK for auth web, and then a React specific that adds some hooks and things specific to React boilerplate called auth React. You don't need to use auth React. The core of the functionality is in auth web. And then, so this is for interacting with the auth service. So this would help redirect the user to log in. And then when you come back, it'll go through the process of the proof key for code exchange for OAuth 2 authentication. And then it'll use that to exchange the authorization code for an authorization token. And so that's a JWT token. And that's what a logged in user would include in their requests to the backend. And so you would use that for like customer specific pricing and display rules. And then we also have a payment SDK. And that also comes with a React specific library that has hooks to remove some boilerplate, but it also comes with a base utility payment.js SDK. And then there's some vendor specific SDKs as well for like PayPal, Amazon Payment Services, etc. And that's being updated regularly as we integrate with more payment integrations. And so that Payment.js SDK also works a little bit with on top of the Commerce SDK. So it'll pull in types and clients from the Commerce SDK to try to help with some common functions that lots of people are going to use when they're integrating with payment. So like with adding a payment to cart, reading a customer's payment addresses, or saved payment methods. So let's look at an example of using the browse client. So we're pulling that in from the Commerce Browse SDK. And so we provide this browse client. You can instantiate it, and then you can provide a set of properties just as pre-configuration, and these can apply to each of the requests as the default values. So in this case, we're setting the application token. The application token is an identifier for the applications in the context of the backend. And so this is like a shorthand way of specifying the context request information that you may have seen in other requests at the endpoints. And so this is just telling the backend, all these requests are in the context of this application. So do all the filtering of entities and catalogs based on what belongs in this application. And then you can also provide a locale, access token if the user is logged in, and things like that. And just an easier way to apply this to the various requests that are getting made. Another interesting thing with the browse client and the other clients for making requests is they're all classes, so you can extend them if you add new endpoints. So you can extend them, add new methods, or you can override the existing methods if you want to make changes to how they work, changing like the parameters that they take. And so it's all extensible. You just create your extension. So like Vodafone browse client extends browse client, and then you instantiate yours instead. So then actually making a request example at the bottom, here we're making a synchronous call to get a product by URL. And so we just pass in the URL. It also takes some additional parameters as options, like the access token, or if you want to override the application token. It's just different things you can do on a per request basis. And then we have more examples of these in reference docs on our developer portal, and I'll show the links to that at the end. And it goes through more examples and documentation of what different clients we have and the different TypeScript types that we have. Before we go, so just looking at how you would add these, I have an example of Yarn. Using Yarn would be similar with Node, but you would just Yarn add quality of commerce, commerce browse, and then we have a syntax so you can get the latest patch version. So in this case, you can add the tag at latest -1.4, and this will give you whatever the latest patch version of that release is. So you can see on the right, that turned into 1.4.2-RC2. We're about to release 1.142 GA, and so that would change to just 1.4.2. So this is just an example of how you add these. So is there any questions going over the front-end SDKs and the storefront starter app?
Hello, Nathan. I have two questions.
Yeah.
First question, what about state management in React? If you guys use anything, you can handling the states in like Redux or something?
So with our app, we're not using Redux, but we are using React contexts. And then a couple
React
places.
context.
Yes. So there's like the use context hook. So it's not, so it's, I guess it's specific to React, not necessarily going to be applicable in Angular. So we can take a look at that if you want. But we do talk a little bit about that in the docs section of the starter.
Okay. My second question, why not all the component or all the SDKs going with React and the JSX, and we can use the advantage of the rendering of the virtual DOM? because it will be more speed and high performance of using JSX instead of JavaScript.
So with the SDKs, they're mostly just a matter of interacting with APIs. So they're not actually rendering components. Therefore, just getting the data or sending requests to the APIs. So they don't really affect whether you're using the virtual DOM or not.
So the rest components will be with JSX, right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the Commerce app or the starter app uses TypeScript and React, so it's using JSX. Or the files will be .tsx for TypeScript, but it's going to be TypeScript on top of JSX.
Okay.
مثلا I have a question. Do you using the caching mechanism just instead of calling the APIs every time of hitting the database?
There's caching on the back end. We haven't set up any specific caching for the front end for the demo app.
So we are using the caching in backend. Is
Yes.
right? Is that right?
Yes.
Do you know which how can I say framework or tools is that it is or what?
So we're using just the standard Spring cache interfaces, but the basic implementation is through Ignite by default. We have other documentation for how to replace that with something else. But Ignite, Apache Ignite is what the default caching is performed by.
Oh, okay, good.
All right, if there aren't any other questions, we'll do an overview of the admin, and then we can actually just go through a demonstration of doing extension with the admin, and then we can just have more free-form discussion after that, if you want to look through the projects. All right, so the admin UI is primarily a couple of libraries. So we're providing a component library and a style library. What we'll be providing you, we're pulling these into an admin starter app as a demonstration. And this admin starter app will have just a sample Express.js node server and a Vite-based dev server. So the admin is React library, metadata driven. So the metadata is JSON structures that define the fields and components that need to be displayed, including labels, validation, different rules, help text, all the endpoints that need to be interacted with. There are a couple of different admin-specific backend services, like metadata service, that pulls in metadata from the other microservices to define what the views are. We have and then obviously there's auth that it interacts with for admin users. And then we have an admin user service that's specific to storing additional information about admin users. This is equivalent of customers, but for the admin rather than for the commerce side. And then there's also the admin navigation service, and that provides the different menu sections you see on the left nav. It's like catalog section and what goes under the catalog section, so like products, categories, option templates. And this will also provide the translations for those fields. And it also defines the order they go in. And then we also provide a JSON or Java-based domain-specific language. And so this is like a builder pattern in Java where you can create this JSON structure, and it adds additional validation around making sure you format the data correctly. Also shows the different options for these different components, because different fields have different requirements, different required properties. Like a date field, you could say the default value for the date field is some sort of date, so like instant.now, versus a string field wouldn't have that. And then also on like a lookup, it will require you to define like a read endpoint, because you need to read those values to look up from somewhere. And then for forms, it will also have like a submit endpoint you need to define. So when you're defining an endpoint, it's a matter of here's the URL and here's the security scope, if there is a security scope. And so there's validation in the admin app around just making sure the user is allowed to do what we're asking them to do. So that can involve, we can hide different fields based on the user's permissions. We can prevent different actions from being performed. And this is all configurable through the metadata. And so we use something for a dev server in the admin starter called Vite. It's like using Create React App, but with far fewer dependencies. So it's not going to scaffold nearly as many different dependencies, and it's far lighter weight. So it's not, because we noticed that Create React App gets fairly bloated fairly quickly. And so let's talk a bit about components. And there are three broad categories of overridable components in the admin. There are named form components, so things like the string field, an external grid collection, which would be, so we have a group of things called external components. And so these are like on the product screen, you'll have a grid that shows the different variants. And so variants have their own endpoint for managing their like CRUD operations. So like create, read, update, delete. So they have their own endpoint that's separate from the product endpoint. And so that's considered like an external grid collection. And so that will have you define separate read endpoint, update endpoint, delete endpoint from the main form, which would be like the products form, which will interact with the products endpoint. And then collapsible groups. So we have different kinds of groups. Entity view. So this is like the actual main product detail page in the admin. And so these are referenced directly by the metadata. And so they'll have a type and a classifier. So the classifiers are field, external, group, and view, with groups just being ways of visually grouping fields. So they could define like these fields can be collapsible, or they're always visible, or they're in line together, and just different things like that. And then views are just the actual pages that are mapped by routes to the overall forms. And so type would be string, external grid, collapsible, entity, so on. And then there are action components. And so these are components that perform actions rather than receive inputs. And so this is like a submit button or a delete button. Those would be represented in metadata as actions. They're referenced based on the parent component. So like whether they're part of a form or part of a grid, and then plus a placement and type. So placement like primary actions or secondary actions, or a top level grid action versus an action on an individual row. So a top level action on a grid would be like create, and then on a row would be edit or delete this individual row. And then there are common components that are not referenced directly by metadata, but are reused throughout the admin. So this is like the button component, the hint component, a label. And so these can be referenced in order to be overridden by name. And so they'll all be prefixed with BL for broadleaf. So like broadleaf button, broadleaf hint, broadleaf label. And for these, you don't need to specify the classifier, just the name or the type. So next, let's actually pull up the admin. Which, so here's what the admin looks like. So these menu items are from the admin navigation service. And then each of these views, so this is a browse view. And so it has this grid where it's going to list all the different vendors, or all the different applications, or all the different products. And so this up here, this add product button in the top right, that's an action. And so that's the primary action of this browse view. And so metadata also lets you define different things like this filter, what filters are available on the grid. And those are usually based on the same thing as the columns you've defined in metadata. Whether this is a catalog product or a catalog entity, so products, categories, product options, these are all inside of catalogs. So you are able to select which catalog you are looking at. From the if you go up here and you select like the heat clinic, it looks a little bit different because you're not looking at every catalog. You're just looking at a subset of the catalogs that are applicable to this application. So in this admin view, we're actually at the tenant level. So this is like the top level organization. In Vodafone's case, an application would be like the eShop could be an application, and then the custom UIs you're building for your kiosks in stores, that could be a different application. And so you could have admins that only look at like the eShop, or you could have top level admins that can manage either the eShop or the kiosk in stores. And so that also lets you look at different products for each application, or different pricing in each application, things like that. So this is also a view. So this is the product update view. And so then we have this form here that acts as a group. So this is a basic form. Then we have this inline group for name and SKU. They're inside this inline group. So name is a field type, SKU is field type. This is a Boolean field. Where is the item individually sold? URI. This is a lookup. So we have defined a lookup. So this is going to hit the the category endpoint to read what categories are available. And then you can select this as the primary category. Products can live in multiple categories, but it can be helpful in terms of searching them to have them in like a primary category. And this component also comes with a grid, so you can look them up this way, and this provides you with filters if there's multiple fields. So in this case, there's only name. But if you had like 1,000 categories and you just wanted to find one quickly, this is one way to do that. So here we have a date field. And then we also have a WYSIWYG HTML field. In this case, this is a read-only because it's demo data. And then we have these two asset fields. And so this is where you could define a primary asset, which is also signified by the star icon in the main asset grid. So you can drag and drop an image here. You can upload them, or you can select one that already exists. It's the library. You can define an asset that you aren't uploading to the admin that lives in some other domain just by providing a URL. And this also lets you provide the title and alt text that are displayed by the front end. And it provides different ways to view them, a grid view versus a list view. And let's look at variants. Oh, this one doesn't have variants. So metadata also lets you conditionally render fields based on type. Let's go to Heat Clinic. So these are variant-based products. I think you've gone over product types already. And so in this case, it has a slightly different menu. So the other product didn't have variations, whereas this one does. So this is an external grid for variants. So it's hitting the variant endpoint to read these variants which belong to this product. And so then it has this additional form you can fill out to create a variant inline. And then that will submit. So this is like a grid action versus these two, the edit and delete, are row actions. There's another useful thing you can do in the admin as a developer. There's on the left side, you have developer settings. And you can select show the metadata. And so then you see these boxes appearing around the different groups and forms and fields. So you can select the gear icon, hit this view metadata, and this will actually show you what the JSON structure looks like. And so this could be a useful way to validate what's being created. So in this case, we see this is a field. It's a resident grid field. It has this augmentation key. So there's something else that you can do in the admin, which I'll show in a little bit, called augmentation, where you can modify the metadata actually from the admin. So you don't have to be a developer to like modify the forms. So this also says, here's the label. This item products are translatable, and this it has these conditionals. So this is like display rules. So in this case, this field only shows up if the product type is variant. And so you can just go through and look at all the metadata responsible for this field. And there's also this customize form button at the top. And so as just a normal admin user, not a developer, you don't have to go into the code, but it'll show a similar screen, but you can go in here and add a new field. So you can add label, a new field, and then you will need to know where this maps to on the entity you're talking to. So you could just put it into attributes map and find the order. Well, I think it already goes into attribute. That was an accident. Default value, not hidden. Looks like there's some display issues with the Boolean buttons. Can make it required. And where'd it go? There it is. Okay, and so now we have this new field, and we mark it as required. You can also go in and edit the field if you don't want it to be required. And so all these augmented fields, these go to live in the metadata service that keeps track of them in a database, versus these other fields are defined just in using the Java DSL. And we'll look at that in a moment. So let's go back and again. Some here. There it is. We'll break down a little bit of what the code looks like as a developer if you're registering new components. And then we'll go into an example of actually doing so. So in this case, we have a component registrar that maps the types and classifiers to the React components. So you can see that on the right. So if you register something else, you want to replace the out-of-box entity field or string field, you would just register with the same key, and then you would map your component to that key. So in the first case, we're overriding the default entity view with a custom entity. In the second, we're registering a brand new component with a brand new key. And so the metadata that you write will reference that key. And then this component renderer will read the metadata, excuse me, will read that metadata and then determine which field using the component registrar to render. So there's a field type, specific renderer, group type, external type, and view type. So for each classifier. So the component renderer will defer to specific classifier's renderer. So in this case, the view type renderer sees the view entity and looks in the component registrar and sees my entity view is what it needs to render. Action components are similar. You just provide a little bit more information. So in this case, you want to tell it the parent classifier view and the parent type entity and then you can provide the actual components information. So you have the component, its placement, and its type. So this could be create, delete, export, different things like that. It doesn't have a specific component renderer. This is usually rendered directly by the parent entity. So it will directly reference the action registrar and like the header component to know which actions to display. We also have support for internationalization and localization of text. We have a few things to automatically help do this. One of the libraries we're using is called React Entel. And so you'll define these static text. So that could be different labels and things that aren't metadata driven, like menus and for the user to log in, log out, different things like that. And so if you have any static text, those are all defined by these defined messages components. All these will end up in JSON files, and then you can send these JSON files out to a translator to actually provide the translations. And so what React Entel uses the Entel JavaScript or API in the browser. It's an abstraction layer on top of that. You can have variables inside of it. So you can see at the bottom. So for all the different locales you expect to support in the admin, you may only be supporting one in Arabic, but you could also do it English or Arabic. And so you just need to specify the same keys for these messages and then provide the correct translation for them. And we have a little script as part of the starter called yarn build langs. And so if you run that, it will look through all the files that have messages and then compile them into the JSON structure for you. And you just need to define what locales you're going to be supporting. It won't automatically translate for you, but it will create the structure that you can send out and have translated. Metadata DSL. So here's an actual look at what the metadata DSL looks like. So for this will also provide like labels for fields, and those labels will also need translations. But this is all written in Java. So just you can use Spring message property files the same way you would for messages in any other Spring platform. So the metadata DSL allows you to build the metadata that we saw using Java. It lets you define all kinds of different things. It lets you define the routes. So like where in the browser, what URL these components display under. We provide a lot of box utilities for this as well. So we'll define a bean for the component routes. We'll define beans for the component sources. And so this will pass in a registry. So in this case, we're registering the top level views. So the browse, the create, and the update forms get added to the registry. And then we have ways to augment what those forms look like. And so we see in the last section, like a get create general form example of using the DSL. So we have a views utility, so views.entityForm. So this is all builder pattern that is provided out of box. And then you add field, and it's very fluent. So you can just do everything in just one code block. And so let's actually pull up some code. So we're going to switch over here. So what I've done in the demo is I've created this new kind of field following the same patterns that we use at Broadleaf. So out of box, we provide this field interface that you can implement for any new types of fields. So we provide a lot of different fields for strings, for integers, all the sorts of basic things. But if you create a new field, we have this interface that you can use to implement that field. So in this case, I'm extending the base field, adding a custom attribute that I want to be provided. and then I have the field class for that to this default new field. And so it really just needs to extend this abstract field, which we provide, and then implement your new interface. And your constructor, you just need to provide the type, and then just make a copy method, which when called will produce a copy of the current field. So this is all pretty easy to do if you ever need to. And then I've created a builder that's similar to the one we have out of box. So you can just call via fields for Vodafone .new field, and it'll produce this. And you can use that the same way as the out of box ones. So we have this configuration class for the demo already. And this is where we're defining this component source. So we're going to look in the registry, and we're going to add this field to product. So we're going to look at the different product types because they have different views. And for each of these product types, we're going to add this new field. So we're going to, in the registry, we're going to get the product update form. Once we have that, we're going to find, or view. Once we have that view, we're going to find the form. So it's like a general form. And then we provide this utility out of box that defines the different forms and fields and how to reference them, so you don't have to guess what they are. So we're finding the form, we're finding the group I want to add it to. So I want to add it with the attributes. And so if we find the attributes, then I'm going to add this new group. So here I'm calling the via fields utility that I made, .new field, and then defining the label, the hint, the help text, and so on. So you'll see I'm referring to a message key as the label. So IntelliJ will hopefully let me go over to this properties file. It lives in resources, where I've defined the default text. Yes, Hassan.
I have a question here. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, this is how you can retrieve the fields dynamic, because in last meeting or the Maria showed how to add a field, for example, in the product table, and it reflected directly to the admin tool. So no need any change or maybe development in the front end. It's just development in the back end. Is that right or not?
Well, what I'm doing here is I'm actually creating a completely new type of field. So this isn't one of the out-of-box fields. So it's similar as far as the backend is concerned, but like out-of-box, we provide a string field. So I'm about to share the front end part of that, which will probably make it clearer. So in the admin starter that you provide, I've gone to the source. I've created this new structure that kind of mimics what we have out of box or in the component library ourselves. So I'm adding this new field type. This is just, it looks very similar to how the string out of box string field looks, but I'm adding this attribute and then just kind of going through the motions of what it looks like as a front-end developer if you wanted to add a completely new type of field to the admin. So in this case, I have this completely new type of field I've defined. I've pulled in the admin components. We have some hooks and utilities that you can use. So all the components will be passed in these different information. So the actual JSON metadata. Formic is a library we use in the admin to manage the form state. And so that's going to get passed into your component. And so it has a list of a map of errors, whether the field has been interacted with, and then the current value of that field. And then you can reference it using the metadata name. And then you can grab this field decorations, which adds the label, which will display errors, which also adds like the augmentation fields. And then you can just,
You are trying to adding new fields from the front end. Is that right?
yes.
And maybe I think to mapping this field in the back end, I should follow the step that Maria did. Is that right? Or maybe something else?
Well, since it's a new field, I created this new interface. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, I see
Okay,
it.
good. So like out of box, we have this field interface. So because this is a completely new thing, I created this new interface. So you don't necessarily have to do this unless, because we can also, you could also just do this part where you're creating a new default field that we provide out of box, and you can provide your type.
Nathan, it might help to show the admin and like what it looks like. I
Yeah.
think there might be a disconnect with when we say field, like what does that actually mean? I think
Mhm.
when
Yes.
we're talking about field, yeah.
So down at the bottom, after I've done all these changes, I show this new field appear. So this isn't a string field. It's not a lookup field. It's just, this is a completely new concept that I created on the fly.
I'm just to understand again, because I see two different how can I say methodology you provided. Maria showed how to add the field from the back end, and it was, I think, it reflected directly to front end without making any development into the front end. Correct me if I'm wrong.
That's correct. And she was using an existing field or component. It's a string component to show it on the back end. What Nathan is showing you, and I think this is the disconnect. It looks the same as a string field, but this can he's showing you the example of, for example, if you wanted to create something like a video component or something that does not exist in our existing library, like a
Okay.
new component. Correct me if I'm wrong,
But
Nathan.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah.
So what
But
Marie showed
from-
you is like reusing components that already exist versus creating a completely new component. So this isn't reflecting a new field on an entity. So like this isn't adding something to product on the back end necessarily, but this is just adding a new component and showing how to display that.
Yeah, it's confusing because it looks like the example here looks like a string field, but it can be another example, like something that doesn't even exist. That might be like I don't know, a product configuration widget or something that is very specific to your implementation, right? That you can build in the front end app and then hook it in to the framework.
sorry again, again, what is the difference between adding the field in the back end or adding the field from the front end? Just I didn't get this point.
So on the back end, that was, okay, so what Marie showed you is going onto the product domain, going to product, and going to this and adding a new field here, or a new property. So what I'm showing you is adding a new React component, if that makes sense. Because I've created this
Okay.
completely new React component. That's a,
Okay, you are okay. It's just not new field, it's a React component. It is-
right.
Okay, perfect.
And then what I was showing here was just how I would use that completely new React component. And so this part is very similar to just adding a new field to a product. It's just referencing the new component that we created. So it may have helped if I started here and went to the other. And so I've created this new component. I'm here in this calling the component registrar to say, here's this new component and here's how the metadata will reference it. And then we also have this where we import it here into this component registration file and then import it into the actual index file. So this is like the root of the app, of the admin app.
And where is you are trying to calling the back end from this component?
So the admin has a lot of architecture around calling metadata service. So you don't actually have to think about that part. You just need to tell the registrar what your component is. And so in the admin, we have this admin provider component, and it sets up a lot of different contexts, so React contexts. And so one of those is the metadata context, which will hit the metadata service and read all of the metadata that the backend has. And then that gets cached in production. And so that part of it you usually don't need to modify. The thing that you're usually going to do is just adding a new type of component that the registrar needs to know about.
Okay.
All right. So yeah, the next thing to do is just asking questions about this. And we do have a lot of different resources in our developer portal that go over the same concepts. And so the unified admin has a section. Each of the SDKs and the Commerce Starter have their own sections with their own docs. And then we also have tutorials that go over customizing the admin through metadata, which is partly what Marie talked about already and a little bit what I talked about just now. All right, any other questions or anything that I didn't cover that you'd like me to cover?
So far so good. Attar, what do you think?
Good يا أسامة تمام.
All right. I think that's all for this session that I prepared because we're about at the hour mark. So if you have anything else, we can use the last several minutes to go over anything else. One thing that might be helpful, so like here's the admin starter app. So you all will receive this. It's part of your client package. And so it's already set up, so it'll run out of box. As we see, we're pulling in our admin components and style libraries, as well as the Tailwind configuration we use out of box. The format.js, which is the React Entol library. So what we can look at that. Our default request client is Axios. And then Formic for handling form state, Lodash general utilities, React, Tailwind. And so when you have, let's look at admin real quick. So the pattern you'll use for like internationalization is you'll have a component. There's a good one. Like a label. I'll have to find one. Hold on. We have these different messages files. And so this is where you put the default text and you'll define a key. And then you'll run the yarn build lang script. And that will generate a messages file. Where did that go? So it'll generate this in.json as the default messages. And then this compiled index.json, which will have all the different locales in it. And so you could have like an ES or an AR, just different JSON files. And then you can grab these. These are all the static text. You can grab them, send them to a translator. And you can see that in different places, there are these brackets. And so these are just the variables. So if in like Arabic, the word order can be different than in English. And so these variables can be placed anywhere and referenced. So if you need to change the word order in a different language, you can just take this and put it a different spot in the same translation, and it won't cause any problems. That makes sense. So like in this case, this is changing the number. So if you need to put that in a different spot, so around this word instead, you can do that.
Nathan, I sent you a link. I'm not sure if you're able to kind of click on that or not, but is there a way that you can maybe just talk through? I think you mentioned some documentation that might be useful for them to look at in those.
Yeah, I don't see it.
projects.
Where'd you send the message?
Slack.
Okay.
Or I can send it on the other one if that's easier for you.
Where? Albert
Maybe.
Batista. Oh, that's not what I meant to do. Okay. So this is okay. So this is like the starter project that you all will get. And it kind of goes over
The different
What's-
ones. So I think in general, the two ones to look at that are relevant to this session are the admin starter project and the Commerce Next.js. Sorry, that's not listed, but it's up there.
it's higher.
Yep. And
So
then
that would be admin starter and then commerce down here.
so those are the two projects that we went over, or Nathan had went over today.
Yep.
In particular.
If we go, you can see where these.
And the code you shared in this meeting already existing on the GitHub. Is that correct?
I haven't uploaded the code to the project yet, but I can commit that just so you can see what it looks like.
Okay.
It's like in our developer portal, you can see the different guides that are available. It talks about the code organization for the starter app. And so I showed these links earlier. It has this document going over how to localize text. And this is maybe something you want to adopt as well in your own eShop because it's not React specific. And then Unified Admin has some documentation here. So just looking between Unified Admin and tutorials is probably going to get you most of what you need. So front-end walkthroughs, we have a homepage walkthrough, which talks about how we built the admin, or not the admin, the homepage. And we talk about what tenant application means, what authentication is. So here we're just going through these different components like admin navigation. So we're hitting this endpoint, and here's what it looks like to hit that endpoint with the menu SDK. And then this is what the JSON response looks like to a menu request. And it also has a link to our open API, which you all will also have access to. And so that takes you out to this Swagger UI, where you can actually try out, here's documentation on the endpoints that you'll interact with. You can add in like a JWT token to act like a authenticated user, and then you can actually try to send requests. And it's giving me an error. So in this case, it's giving me an error response, but theoretically, you can use this to just test out the APIs. And so all this is just available.
Right. Thank you, Nathan. If there's anything else, please feel free to reach out to us, and Brad will compile the list of, I guess, active open questions, and we can address those offline as well. All right. Well, thank you guys, and we will see you tomorrow.
All right. Have a good day.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.